Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is The Vampire Lestat by Anne Rice. Now, The Vampire Lestat was published in 1985, and parts of this novel were actually previously published in an issue of Twilight Zone Magazine. Now, The Vampire Lestat is both a sequel and a prequel to Anne Rice's 1976 novel, Interview with the Vampire, and it's the second book of her horror-slash-dark fantasy series, The Vampire Chronicles. Now, I already reviewed the first book in this series, and I'll leave a link in the description below to where you can check out that review. Now, I actually already did a review on this book years and years ago, back in 2012. Now, my old review is technically still up, however it's no longer public. It's now marked as unlisted, but you can see it with a link, and I'll leave a link in the description below to where you can check out my old review. Now, here's where I'm kind of a dumbass for re-reviewing this book, because early in 2017, Anne Rice herself actually tweeted my old review of this book. And that's actually part of the reason why I didn't out-and-out take down my old review, because the author herself tweeted it. And I really wanted to reread these books and re-review them because I think this is a great series, and I do not think my old reviews of the Vampire Chronicles really did these books a justice. And honestly, I think The Vampire Lestat is a better book than Interview with the Vampire. Don't get me wrong, Interview with the Vampire is a good book, but I actually liked this book better. I think it moved at a much quicker pace, which is ironic because I think this book is actually longer than the first one. But I think this book really did set the tone for the rest of the series. This book really does feel like the bridge between Interview with the Vampire and what the series would eventually become. Now, the plot of this book is it follows the character of Lestat, who is the main villain of Interview with the Vampire. What happens is he wakes up in modern-day America, and by modern day I mean the 1980s when this book was published. And he introduces himself to a rock band and reveals to them what he is, and he ultimately becomes the lead singer of this band, and they become famous, and he tells the world that he's a vampire. Now, the general public believes that this is just some gimmick for the band, and Lestat is not actually expecting the general public to buy that he's a vampire, but the reason he's doing this is because he knows this is gonna piss off other vampires out there. And then Lestat writes his autobiography, and that's essentially what the rest of the book is. It's the autobiography of Lestat and how he became a vampire and his early adventures as this vampiric being leading up to the events of Interview with the Vampire. So in the book you find out that Lestat was a young man living in 18th century France, and he was basically the black sheep of his family. Like, the only person in his family who genuinely respected him was his mother, Gabrielle, who he had a deep affection for. And then one day, Lestat and his friend and possible lover, Nicholas, run away to Paris, where Lestat finds success as an actor. But then one night, Lestat is kidnapped by an insane vampire named Magnus, who turns him against his will. But after becoming a vampire, he embraces what he calls the dark gift, and he ultimately ends up turning his mother, who is dying. And his mother, Gabrielle, when she becomes a vampire, she ends up embracing it even more than Lestat does. And they do end up crossing paths with other vampires who don't really like them at first, but they do manage to get the upper hand. And Lestat does end up turning Nicholas, but this does not work out the way he had planned. And the book doesn't really have a set plotline. Much like Interview with the Vampire, it's very episodic in how it's structured. It's almost more of a series of different episodes in Lestat's life, or at least his life after becoming a vampire. But the book does lead to Lestat becoming obsessed with an ancient vampire named Marius, who is the keeper of those who must be kept. I won't give away who they are, but they are very, very important. But The Vampire Lestat is a very good book. It's not just a really good sequel to Interview with the Vampire, but it's also a really good book on its own. And again, I do kind of like this better than Interview with the Vampire. What really separates the two books is Interview was much more of a drama, and this is much more of an adventure novel. But like Interview with the Vampire, this book very much explores these themes of sexuality and relationships. Now, in the book, it becomes clear that Lestat is at the very least bisexual. Like his friend Nicholas, it's heavily implied that they're actually lovers, and I think that was really brave on Anne Rice's part to have a relationship like that in a book around this time. Like, nowadays it might not be that big of a deal, but in the 80s, homosexuality was still kind of an underground thing. I mean, keep in mind, this was the beginning of like the AIDS epidemic, and people back then were calling AIDS the gay cancer. So I think books like Anne Rice's books and like the works of Clive Barker were so important for the time. But the relationship between Lestat and Nikki, it's so sad what ends up happening between them. I also think Lestat's relationship with Gabrielle is really interesting, where she's his mother, but when he turns her into a vampire, it's almost as if the roles are reversed, and she kind of becomes his child to a certain extent. But as the novel goes on, their relationship kind of develops into, and I know how creepy this is gonna sound, but it almost becomes sort of a spousal relationship. And Gabrielle, I think, might be the most interesting character in the book. And I think Anne Rice definitely explores a lot of feminist themes with this character, because as a human, you gotta understand that she's a woman living in the 18th century, when women did not have a very high status in society, and she kind of feels like a prisoner in this marriage to Lestat's father. But when she becomes a vampire, it's almost like this liberation from the rules that society puts on women. And you also see those feminist themes in the parts of this book taking place in modern day, where Lestat is kind of struck by how women's places in society has vastly improved since his time. I also like how this book explores the mythology a lot more, but still leaves enough of it up to the reader's interpretation, because you realize that the vampires themselves do not have all the answers. Like, you find out about those who must be kept, and you also find out that there are other supernatural creatures in this universe besides vampires. Like, you find out that there are demons, but despite the fact that demons exist, the vampires still don't know whether or not there is a god or a Satan. And you find out that there are other immortals out there that might not be vampires. So it really does explore the world, but it leaves enough of it ambiguous. The book also has a really interesting commentary on religion, where you find out that Lestat has a real disdain and contempt for religion. But in the book you find out that many vampires believe that they are the spawns of Satan, so a lot of vampire covens are basically satanic cults, but Lestat finds this to be ridiculous, which is why it's kind of ironic that later on in the series, Lestat will end up meeting God and the devil, but that's not till book 5, so I'm getting ahead of myself. But when Marius comes into the novel, you find out that there was a time when humans basically worshipped the vampires as gods. So again, there is definitely a commentary on religion in the novel. But also, in the parts of this book that take place in modern day when Lestat becomes a rock star, there is an interesting commentary on the rock star lifestyle and rock fandom. Like, there's a scene towards the end of this book during Lestat's first concert where he's looking at his fans and he starts to wonder if there really is much of a difference between his fans and these druid cults that Marius told him about who worshipped the vampire. I also think it's interesting how Lestat was the villain in the first novel, but is pretty much the hero in this novel, and would basically be the main protagonist of this series throughout the rest of the series, or at least up until book 5, which was the last book in the series that I read. But Lestat was a piece of shit in the first novel, but in this novel, which mostly acts as a prequel to Interview with the Vampire, you kind of find out why. But you also get an idea in this book that Louis might have exaggerated how evil Lestat really was. At the same time, maybe Lestat is exaggerating how good he actually is. Like, it's very much the unreliable narrator trope. And you do get other characters from Interview with the Vampire who show up in this, like Armand and obviously Louis, but you see them in a different light. Like, you see them from Lestat's point of view. I also like how the book does get kind of meta, where you find out that the boy who interviewed Louis in Interview with the Vampire published the transcript from that interview as a book that the general public takes as fiction. So Interview with the Vampire, even though this is in continuity with that book, it's also a novel within this novel's universe. So it does play around with a few metafiction tropes where the book is very much commentating on that first novel. Now, those who must be kept from this novel do play a major role in the next book in this series, The Queen of the Damned, which picks up right where the modern-day portions of this novel leave off. Now, as I mentioned before, there is talk in this book of other immortals who aren't vampires, and there's a reference to somebody called Ramses of the Damned, and that could possibly be the titular character of Anne Rice's novel The Mummy, or Ramses of the Damned, which appears to be in the same universe as this. Like, I don't think Anne Rice does the whole shared universe thing the same way that Stephen King does, but at least her Vampire Chronicles series does seem to connect to some other books. Like, I know her series Lives of the Mayfair Witches is in the same universe as Vampire Chronicles as well. Now, this book did have a comic book adaptation in the early 90s, and of course the first book in this series, Interview with the Vampire, was adapted into a film of the same name in 1994. And in that movie, Tom Cruise played Lestat, and honestly, I think it might be Tom Cruise's best performance. Now, I'm not the biggest Tom Cruise fan. There are some movies where I think he does great in, and then there are some movies where I just kind of want to punch him in the face, but in that movie, I did not see Tom Cruise. I saw Lestat. He was Lestat in that movie. Now, there never was a proper film adaptation of this book, but the movie Interview with the Vampire almost ended like there was going to be, because the movie ended where Lestat rejoined civilization, and you saw him driving off in Daniel Malley's car, listening to Guns N' Roses' cover of Sympathy for the Devil, foreshadowing that this guy is eventually going to become a rock star. But unfortunately, a film adaptation of this book never came to fruition. Instead, in 2002, we got a film adaptation of the third book in the series, The Queen of the Damned, which did incorporate some elements from Vampire Lestat. And in that movie, Stuart Townsend played Lestat, and he wasn't bad in the movie, but that was not a very good movie at all. Now, there was a musical adaptation of this book with music done by Elton John. Now, before I end this video, I want to cut to a short review on this book done by my friend Christian Feliciano.
You see, I cannot be forsaken, because I'm not the only one. We walk amongst you, feeding, reaping. Must we hide from everyone? Okay, now let me stop that. So, The Vampire Lestat by Anne Rice. This is one of the greatest books I've ever read. I hate to just come out and say it outright, but it is. Anne Rice is one of those gems that we have in this world that we really cannot lose, and I hope to death that a vampire finds her out there. I don't know who. I don't know if it's going to be Lestat. I don't know if it's going to be Dracula, one of the Twilight vampires. I don't know. But I would love to see a vampire go to Anne Rice and give her immortality so she can stay with us forever. Because she is just amazing. She is just so beautiful. I love her writing. I love her spirit. I love her Facebook page. I love her views, everything. I mean, I just love her. She's amazing. She's fantastic. And I use the word fantastic so much, but it's so true. Anne Rice is just one of the greatest things to ever touch the earth. And I hope that we never lose her. I know she's getting up there in age, so please, whoever's out there, Blade, if you could just find Anne Rice and give her some powers to stay here forever, I would love it. Because, not only this book, but just all her books in general. I mean, even the stuff she's been writing lately. I mean, The Wolf Gift and the rest of the Vampire Chronicles books and whatever else she's putting out. Just amazing. I love everything she writes. And Vampire Lestat is definitely up there as one of the best novels ever. It's not my favorite. And that's not to say that it's any less than Interview with a Vampire. I think I like Interview with a Vampire more just because of nostalgic reasons, because it is the first one I read, and it is the first movie I watched of the Vampire Chronicles, which there are only 2, so anyway. It definitely is equal to the Interview with the Vampire book. It's just that, like I said, for nostalgic reasons, I like Interview with a Vampire more, but this is just as good. It's amazing, and in fact, if you had never read the Interview with the Vampire book, and you just jump into the Vampire Lestat, you can pretty much understand most of it. I mean, you're going to want to get the Interview with the Vampire just because, you want to get the full story and all that. But the fact that this is his autobiography, this is him telling you his story from the beginning to pretty much to where Interview with the Vampire is, and then, of course, afterwards, you could get the gist of it without really reading Interview with the Vampire, which I don't recommend again. Like I said, I think you should read it. It is one of the, best books ever. And just to get the full story, just so you could get Lestat, how he was and how he is now, and to kind of understand a full story, his entire life. And this one I love because it really does show you how vampires are created. I mean, it happens in the first one as well, but in this one you get to see a little bit more into the vampire world, and you get to see into Lestat's head. You get to see how he thinks and why he is the way he is, why he is such a brat, why he is such a violent animal. You get to sympathize with him more than you did in Interview with the Vampire. And you get to see that he really wants to break out of secrecy. He doesn't want to live in the shadows anymore. He wants to come out and reveal himself to the world. That's why he's writing this book. And he also wants to fix what Louis wrote about him in Interview with the Vampire. But that's besides the point. Because at the end of the day, he doesn't really care what people think about him. So he wants to just reveal himself to the world. He wants to become a rock star. He wants to live in fame and infamy. He wants to be, just on top of the world. He wants to be everything that you can basically be in this world, especially if you have powers like a vampire. I love it. I love that he just open and he doesn't care about the consequences. He doesn't care if the world is going to be destroyed because of this. He doesn't care if there's going to be more love because of it. He doesn't care. He just loves, he just wants to be out there. And that's the best part about this, because I always wondered, especially before I knew about this one. I always knew about Interview with the Vampire, but I didn't know that the series continued after that. I just thought that the story ended when I saw the movie when I was a kid, because I watched the movie first before I read the book. And I always wondered, why don't vampires, if they really existed, why wouldn't they come out and just reveal themselves to the world? They're so powerful. Why hide in the shadows? I know that there are hunters out there, but, as a team, they could take over the world. They could just be on top of the world. They can be rich and famous and do whatever they wanted, be on TV, do whatever they wanted, just live the dream. And I love that Anne Rice addresses that and actually makes Lestat that. He actually is that. The only thing about this book is that if you buy it, make sure you buy Queen of the Damned also. Because, no spoilers, but there is a huge cliffhanger at the end of the book. And it's going to leave you jaw-dropped. You're just going to be like, no, I can't, what? And then you're going to want to go out and buy it anyway. So just buy it, buy both of them. Make sure you read Vampire Lestat, and then you read Queen of the Damned right after, just so you can get the full story, because if not, you're going to lose your mind. Yes, you can read it without Interview with the Vampire, but you need Queen of the Damned to finish the story. And believe me, you will not regret it. This is a fantastic book. It's worth all the money in the world. Definitely go out and get it. It's fantastic. Pacing is amazing. Writing is beautiful as always. Anne Rice is a poet. As I always say, she just really is a poet with her words. She knows how to convey messages beautifully without being preachy. And she also knows how, you know, her prose is very beautiful. The way she describes things. Her dialogue is amazing. She definitely has an ear for dialogue. She really knows how to write a book. And this is just fantastic. This is one of the greatest books ever written. I recommend everybody check it out. And yeah, thank you so much. Bye-bye.
So, I hope you enjoyed his take on this book, and I hope you enjoyed this video overall. That was my review on The Vampire Lestat by Anne Rice, and bye.